starting out with Women of Wonder, when I first thought of doing that, it just seemed at the time it was I think the collision of the feminist movement just getting going in the 60s, having that going on, and realizing that science fiction even then seemed to be relegating women in the stories largely to the female character who the male character falls in love with, or she's basically a sidekick, or she's a minor character or whatever. There just were not, there were mostly traditional roles there. And I said, that struck me as odd. And then it also struck me as odd that there wasn't a book with women's stories by women, but that wouldn't have been enough by itself. I didn't want to have, here's a book that shows you that the women who are writing science fiction could write it just as well as the men who are writing it, or writing the same kinds of things. I said, I want to see what they were doing with female characters. So when I was editing those books, I wanted to concentrate on stories, not just that were by women, but that were about women in the story, where the women where the female character or characters were central to the particular story, because that just made more sense to me. And then I spent a long time trying to sell it, which for various reasons, and some of it being that I was young and just starting out and had no experience, so I can understand publishers being worried about that. And also just feeling that the audience wasn't there. Women weren't reading it, so there was really no audience for it. I had a couple of editors tell me that specifically. They said, well, we won't sell enough copies because there aren't enough people who will be interested in it. And it turned out there were a lot of people who were interested in it. And it was just basically, I would say, the confluence of events. Had I grown up in a different time, I wonder if I would have edited the book. If it hadn't been for Vonda McIntyre telling me that Vintage was interested in such a book, and knowing that I had been trying to sell mine for a couple of years, I don't know it would have happened either. And then I had to do a good job, because I said, if I don't, I'll screw it up for everybody. I didn't want to do that.
I came to it because I liked those kinds of stories when I was a little kid. And the first story I ever wrote at the ripe old age of 6 was a fantasy. And it really was a story. It had a beginning, a middle, and an end in that order. And that's important, you know.
Mm-hmm.
Your readers like it so much better if it makes sense. But I started looking for things that turned on the imagination. And the thing that really got me is I finally stumbled across a story by Theodore Sturgeon. And if you don't know his work, shame on you.
Mm-hmm.
He was masterful. He didn't write a lot, because I found out later on that he wanted to do all his writing in one fell swoop, sit down at the typewriter and not get up until he'd finished writing it. And that doesn't make long stories all that easy. But he did a wonderful book called Some of Your Blood, which was about a young man who's rather bewildered and feels a need to drink blood. And I found out later from Betty Ballantyne that it was actually based on a real case. And they more or less tied him to the chair until he finished writing it.
I don't know if it's not so much about it being a woman, but it's about being African American, or even having if I have any Black vernacular in the stories, sometimes there's resistance to that, which is quite different. I think it's interesting because I feel like if I said the characters were Jamaican, or if I said the characters were from a Caribbean place or something, then there wouldn't be as much pushback, perhaps. That's something they recognize. There's not the assumption that if you have this accent that you are somehow ignorant, or if you have this accent that you don't know how to code switch, right? So there
Mhm.
might be some resistance in that regard, but not necessarily
Right.
I was female, you know. Yeah, the one thing I
Right.
do find resistance in is in the editing, though, in editing. So I
Mm.
have, you know, received like strange random letters. You know, I had to at one point put in our call for submissions, or just to mention that if you send me rape stories and it's not, you know, and it's treated like a plot device, it's not treated like an actual thing that happened to a real person. It's an automatic rejection. Like I'm not spending any energy on that. So it's like I could tell very quickly when I started editing the magazine of fantasy and science fiction that some of the submitters, some of the writers were not accustomed to having their work read by a woman, even though of course edited, but
Yeah.
you could just tell, like, you think, would you send that story,
Mhm.
that same story to a woman editor and
Mhm.
think that the objectification of women in the story is going to fly well, or you know, just certain kinds of things, like, you know, that are, you can just tell they're not accustomed to that, you know, having it read in that way. So that's been interesting, some pushback in that regard. Initially I think they've all gotten the message.